Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to discuss in the first segment of today's show with Jeffrey Sachs, who is a global economist and university professor at Columbia University. He's joining us, of course, from New York. Now, Jeffrey has written an article recently about the case of two global mining companies that, thanks to the World Bank's flawed and corrupt investment arbitration process, were able to make a fortune, really, a shakedown of $5.9 billion, which were awarded to those companies against Pakistan's government. This was for an illegal project, deemed illegal, of course, according to Pakistani law and according to Pakistan's own courts. Now, this, of course, we can get into the details, of course, but on the outside and as a macro issue, this then goes to show how multinational companies around the world, as Jeffrey has argued as well, and we'll speak to him in a moment about, are able to then take advantage of quote-unquote developing or third world countries, as Pakistan would be labeled. So let's of course thank Jeffrey for joining us. Jeffrey, we appreciate your time today. Jeffrey, about how important cases such as this are, because I mean, I imagine at some level Pakistanis are possibly not even aware of the details of this to a very large extent, but even the rest of the world.
Well, this is a bizarre case. This is a judgment against Pakistan for almost $6 billion for a mining project that never took place. And it failed because it was deemed to be an illegal contract that had been entered into by an agency in Baluchistan way back in 1993 with a U.S. mining company. It had a very twisted history, but the Pakistan Supreme Court said in 2013 that the contract had violated so many clauses of Pakistan's mining codes and contract laws that it could not go forward. At that point, not the original mining company, but two other mining companies that had bought into the project for a modest amount of money, then used an arcane process of international treaty law, an arbitration process, actually of a panel of three arbitrators under the jurisdiction of the World Bank, to claim that Pakistan owed these mining companies all of the future profits that would have ever taken place on this project on extraordinarily favorable terms to the mining companies. And this tribunal gave an award against Pakistan to these two companies of nearly $6 billion. It's a devastating award. Pakistan absolutely needs to contest this with all its power and to show the world community how unbelievably unjust this is.
So then why do you think this system has been able to then take advantage, as you've argued, of course, as well, of countries such as Pakistan?
Well, this is a rigged system where the powerful countries have put into treaties or insisted in treaties with Pakistan and other developing countries that a process be put in place that favors investors. The investors have rights, it seems, that extend beyond the legality of their contracts, beyond their bad behavior. And this is not truly a law-based process. Indeed, it is a complete slap in the face, an abuse of Pakistan's own Supreme Court rulings and Pakistan's laws. It's three arbitrators who, without any legal boundaries, are able to make this kind of award under a bilateral investment treaty between Pakistan and Australia in this case. But this kind of abuse is taking place all over the world. It's the power of vested interests, especially multinational companies, Wall Street, hedge funds who buy into these judgments, and these arbitrators who make a living on this kind of activity. And it's absolutely abusive.
And, this has been an issue, as you well know, of course, Jeffrey, that for a number of years has, of course, affecting the world, where you have multinational companies who are more powerful than governments around the world. And that sort of defies logic, doesn't it? Where a company can override, as it has, or two companies can override, as they have in this case, even Pakistani law. How does that system change? Is it about breaking down these companies? How does one go about reforming the system then?
Well, I think the first point is that the people in the world need to know what we're discussing now. Needs to become aware around the world. I think the government of Pakistan and other governments that have been abused by this process should take this to the United Nations, should take it to the World Bank, actually. There is a board of the World Bank. Pakistan is represented at the board. This is an abuse of law. It's an abuse of sovereignty. It's a threat to Pakistan's finances. I point out that the judgment here is larger than the entire health budget of the country of Pakistan. It's unbelievable, the burden that would be arbitrarily and capriciously imposed on Pakistan. And one should understand how bizarre this is, because what this tribunal, or these three arbitrators, did was to say that these two companies deserve decades of future profits on a project that never took place. And then the arbitrators decided what the principles of the project would be, what the royalty rates would be, what the tax rates would be, as if they were the government of Pakistan, for a project that doesn't exist, for negotiations that never took place, for an agreement that was never made, with the major environmental risks to this project and social risks, because there are people living in this region as well that have rights. But the arbitrator said, we are the law. We have the power. And in this completely arbitrary way, made this judgment. I hope that the government of Pakistan gets together with other governments in developing countries that have been abused in this process and says, no, we're not going to abide by something so arbitrary and capricious.
If I'm not mistaken, Jeffrey, one of the arbitrators was or is in some way connected to one of these companies. I was reading that in one of the details that in one of the articles, I believe it was your article itself, of course, that spoke about this. Then I imagine then that goes to the heart of the issue as well, where it's corruption, right? It's this sort of, behind the scenes dealings which are occurring at these sorts of tribunals, quote unquote, that are in place around the world in such international organizations, which are meant to be, of course, neutral and passing judgments which are not biased towards any one party from the get-go, that is. What do you make of how one can then tackle that corruption? Because that, I would imagine that for any tribunal to have somebody who is already sided, really, with one of the parties, that sort of just defies logic, doesn't it?
I think that the issue here is, if I understand it, a little bit different, but goes to the core of a process that doesn't work. One of the arbitrators was actually involved in a different country, not with these companies, but in a different country as one of the litigators. In other words, in another case where the legal issues would be the same, he's making judgments in one case where he's actually acting in a law firm, as part of a law firm that is making a case in another country. And so I think that the issue here was a kind of a conflict of interest, not with the arbitrator related to the company, but to a process. Yeah. And the point is how arbitrary this is, because these arbitrators are not judges. This is not a court. This does not have the basis of rule of law. And it directly ignores Pakistan's rule of law, because it completely waved away, gave the back of the hand to the Supreme Court of Pakistan, which had ruled that this whole structure, starting back in 1993, was based on violations of Pakistan's mining codes and contract law. And it's a process that's so twisted. I'm not a deep expert in it, but when you read through the dozens of years of litigation, There are so many charges of corruption, mismanagement, inappropriate behavior. These companies misbehaved constantly, trying to rewrite special privileges for themselves that should disqualify this, as the Supreme Court said. But the arbitrator said, we're not going to look at any of that. We're just going to award these two companies as if this project took place, and we're going to give them decades of phantom profits based on our judgment, three people, of what taxes would have been applied, of what rules would have been applied. It's amazing.
I mean, I imagine, Jeffrey, at some level, this doesn't say much about the World Bank, right? It led this arbitration process to begin with. Do you think that at some level the international laws that currently govern such issues need to be changed or revisited? Because, I mean, it also defies logic for me that the international laws are set up in the way that they are, and these arbitration tribunals are set up in the fashion that they are. I mean, that very design needs to be changed, doesn't it?
This was a pretty arcane procedure 20 years ago, the idea of going to arbitration. And there was a glimmer of logic to it, which is that if an investor is putting in investments, that it should be able to have its rights recognized if they were abused. But it's gotten completely out of hand as an abusive money machine, actually funded by hedge funds on Wall Street, who invest in these cases to see what comes up, because it just takes three arbitrators agreeing to give billions of dollars, and you take home quite an award out of this. And so it has become by now an abuse against the rule of law. And people who study this are completely alarmed at how it takes away the rights of governments for normal regulation, for normal rule of law, for normal adjudication of contracting procedures. It has removed the power here of Pakistan, but it's true all over the world, of governments to engage in environmental regulation, to scrutinize contracts in a completely arbitrary way. But it became big business of the law firms, of the hedge funds, of the Wall Street investors. And the World Bank absolutely needs to see that it is a dark stain on the bank at this point. And this specific judgment absolutely needs to be overturned. It is so arbitrary in its nature and so damaging to Pakistan, it just must not go forward.
You know, I mean, damaging to Pakistan, of course, it's interesting also that Pakistan obviously is a country which wants to lift its economy up, as would any country, of course, around the world. And this hurts that process too, right? So, I mean, where the world would turn to a country like Pakistan and say, listen, you need to do better vis-a-vis your economy. But then when Pakistan is trying to do better and, of course, is trying to create a more friendly atmosphere for investors, even with many years ago, if this did occur at that time, you know, we're not talking about, of course, 2019 when this occurred, but that sort of just discourages one, doesn't it? Where it's sort of like this vicious cycle where we're all stuck in, where we're trying to lift ourselves out of poverty, or, you know, not be any more developing country and lift ourselves to the level of a developed country, but we're not really being allowed to do that.
Well, it is ironic because Pakistan does want to have a business environment in which investments can take place. And that's why some people say, oh, we should just go along with this. But it's too expensive to go along with and too outrageous just to go along with. We have to help people to understand the facts and to make a distinction between a proper business investment and a rather sordid, unprincipled process that took place. Indeed, the whole history of this project is a pretty awful one. It does go back 26 years now to actions that were taken by a provisional government and by an agency in Baluchistan that didn't know, maybe it knew what it was doing in some dark sense, but not from a legal investor business sense, and took decisions that it did not have legal authority to take, and created this path of a massive mess. Okay, one could say that mistakes were made on so many sides and so many dimensions, but that doesn't mean that Pakistan should pay $6 billion for a non-existent project. That's just outrageous.
And, as you said, the rich, at one point you say the rich are making a fortune at the expense of poor countries. Does this then, do you think, just create that sort of, situation where inequality then around the world just continues?
Well, the world is a very unequal place, of course, and the rich have gotten richer, and the poor are treated with impunity and don't have access to justice, can't have their voice raised. But I'm a big believer in international law, nonetheless, that we have to try to make it work. I'm a big believer in the United Nations. I believe that if we put facts on the table globally, help people to understand them, that we can get to better justice than we have. If decisions are made in back rooms, in secret bargains, in corrupted dealings, of course, the poor always lose in that. If we pursue the rule of law, if Pakistan takes this in a very transparent way to the board of the World Bank or to the UN General Assembly and says this is not a kind of process consistent with all of the global norms and all of the high rhetoric about the need for sustainable development, I think it will make progress, actually.
And, what do you make of the politics of all of this? Because, I imagine that also plays into such situations, doesn't it? Do you think that the politics just around the world where you have a system, for example, at the United Nations, I'll just use as an example, where you have certain countries who have veto power, for example. It's sort of a rigged system where you have preferential treatment for certain countries versus other countries. And that's sort of just the way the world is set up.
Well, on paper, we're supposed to have a rule of law. In practice, we have a lot of abuse. Rather than ripping up the paper, I would try to make it work because we really need principles, we need rules. And right now, we have two huge problems. One is that companies act with impunity. They're very powerful. They pay the campaign contributions of politicians. Politicians follow their whims. It's a big business. Even this arbitration, obscure process has become a big business of billions and billions of dollars. So this is what needs to be resisted. I believe that when facts are shown, not always, but one can push back. This is a case that I think requires public scrutiny, where Pakistan needs to say, no, this is too abusive, too capricious, too arbitrary, even to think about going along with just in the name of trying to be pleasant and to show that we're cooperative. That is too expensive a deal in this case.
And Jeffrey, I'll just ask your final thoughts before letting you go this morning. What do you make of the precedent that these sorts of cases set then for others who are watching, right? So, as you said, no country wants to come off as being tough for investors. This is sort of a catch-22 situation at some level.
Scholars that are looking at this are saying, stop this process. We need to make a fundamental change because of the trap that it puts countries like Pakistan in, exactly as you're saying. Pakistan wants to behave properly to help the economy to grow. But on the other hand, if behaving properly means being a victim of capricious abuse like this, it's intolerable. And that's why a worldwide community of scholars that really look at this issue are outraged. That's the starting point for real change.
Very well, Jeffrey. We'll leave it there for now. But of course, we'd certainly appreciate your time this morning. That was Jeffrey Sachs. It was an honor, sir, to speak to you. Viewers, this case or these cases about these two global mining companies and their claims against Pakistan, and as Jeffrey there said, they've been given this shakedown money, this $5.9 billion award by an arbitration council, World Bank-led arbitration council, tribunal, I should say. And this is all for what they possibly hypothetically would have made in the years to come had those illegal projects. That's a very important detail here. Had those illegal projects gone through. Illegal, why? Because they were against Pakistani laws. They were against Pakistani laws as determined, A, by the laws themselves, and B, by the Pakistani Supreme Court, which looked at these sorts of deals that had been signed back in the early 90s and said, listen, this goes completely against our country's laws. We can't allow for this to go through. Those projects didn't even begin. These illegal projects too didn't even begin, but yet these companies are being awarded money for a hypothetical situation which we don't even know that they would have made that sort of money in the decades, weeks, years to come. So this again goes back to, as Jeffrey has said in his article, and he said with us as well, that the rich really are setting up a system where they take advantage of poor countries or developing countries such as Pakistan, who are trying their best to create an investor-friendly environment, of course, to be able to lift themselves up, but yet are being beaten down within this vicious circle which has been created by the global banking and global financial system. We'll leave it there for now, though. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of the program, I'm going to discuss Israeli settlements and the wedge that is possibly driving between the European Union and the United States. As we know, the U.S. has declared that essentially all Israeli settlements, especially those in the occupied West Bank, are legal. Now, this goes, of course, against what international law says, but that's never stopped Donald Trump before and his administration. So they've declared, as they so wish, that these settlements are legal. The Europeans, though, disagree strongly, and they've made that case quite clear in a statement that came out soon after the U.S. announcement as well. Now, obviously, as I said, international law does declare that these Israeli settlements are illegal. They are obviously a hindrance, according to the Europeans, to any possible two-state solution in that region, Israel-Palestine as two separate states. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by our panelist, Harry Fear, who is a journalist and filmmaker who is originally based in Oxford in the UK, but he is traveling now to Lilongwe in Malawi. We're also joined by Yousef Al Helou, who is a journalist and political analyst. He's an expert in Palestinian and Middle East affairs. He's joining us now from London. And joining us from Albuquerque in New Mexico in the U.S. is Katherine Hughes-Fraitekh, who is an expert on Middle East peace and justice and nonviolent social movements. She has worked especially around the issue of Israel-Palestine as a program manager, trainer, analyst, researcher, and activist. Katherine, Yousef, and Harry, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Harry, let me start with you. What do you think it is that prompted the U.S. to declare these clearly illegal settlements, according to international law, legal?
This is really because of a political alignment of the right in the US and the right in the Netanyahu regime in Israel. They have similar worldviews, they have similar ambitions, and have similar authoritarian tendencies. And so this is an alignment and a realpolitik where two sets of interests are served. And of course, this is very pleasing to Netanyahu and also very much part of Trump's world playbook as well. That is to not respect the rules, and might is right.
And Katherine, what are your thoughts about that? Because you're sitting in the U.S. So do you think that there's been enough shockwaves there in the U.S. about this? I mean, from what I've observed, it's just been very muted responses within the U.S. borders.
Yes, basically, I would agree with Harry that it is basically a political gift to Netanyahu. He's been a close ally of Trump's. They both have seen the worldview as might is right. They both have not followed international law. And the settlements are just one more part of that. Obviously, the U.S. has moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was against international law. And it's also tried to recognize the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, which, again, the U.S. cannot do from this side. One hopeful sign from the U.S. is that the U.S. congressmen, there have been 107 of them, just signed a letter a couple of days ago. Many of them had gotten back from trips, a few of them with J Street contingent. And it's a very strongly worded letter to Secretary of State Pompeo. Many of them that have actually been pro-Israeli in the past, that is calling for an end to this policy, is showing how it interferes with the two-state solution, is talking about how it is against international law and human rights. So while the response has not been strong, that is one positive part of this that I see.
Indeed. Okay, so Yousef, what are your thoughts sitting there in London? Europeans don't seem to be playing ball, and they don't agree, obviously, with Donald Trump and his declaration on these settlements. Why do you think it is that the Europeans are standing strong on this issue of settlements at this time? I mean, we know that they very much are still, though, under the influence of Israel, aren't they?
Well, first of all, the timing of Pompeo's decision is significant. It's a gift to a friend in need. So I share the same point of view of your guests. And let's not also forget that the so-called deal of the century is being implemented already. And this is part of that deal, considering Israeli illegal settlements are no longer illegal. On the ground, this doesn't mean anything because Israel has been annexing and occupying parts of the West Bank and international silence. The position of the EU, of course, is against the US policy. The EU wants to show that it is with the implementation of the international law, and I think it could be to show the EU that because the EU has considered the settlements products produced in the settlements that should be labeled, and so it could be a counter decision from the US, a slap on the face of the EU to show them that they should be on the same line as the United States.
But then, Harry, the question then remains, that is the two-state solution even viable at this time? I mean, are the Europeans and the rest of the world sort of running after a dream, which at this time is not even realistic?
A dream that I'm not sure really would meet anyone's aspirations at this stage. I think, obviously, we call it a two-state solution, but in a sense, more now, it would be a dream in the sense it's more of a model, it's more of a theory of how things could work out. But the fact is that we now have a kind of quasi one-state reality already. And so as that gets further entrenched, the notion of two states and two separate peoples becomes the dream. You're basically separating something that is deliberately being further entangled by the Israeli occupier. And so, indeed, the Europeans continue to hold dear to this theme and this concept. But I think the most cynical observers know clearly that actually this is their kind of signposting and outrage. But they know very well, because all of their delegations visit the territories, they know very well that actually this, if you like, soft provision of cover for the Israeli state, given the circumstances on the ground. As long as we can keep talking about this dream that is further and further unviable, it provides further time for the Israeli state to make the one-state domination a reality that is undoable.
Katherine, what are your thoughts on that? Because many would argue, Katherine, that what the U.S. is doing, and I believe this was a decision or something that had been stated before, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, about that move to Jerusalem of the embassy, that what the U.S. was doing was just stating the obvious and just recognizing what is already obvious on the ground, whether we like it or not, of course, that can be argued separately. So do you think that in some ways this recognition of these settlements as legal is sort of just something that would have happened anyways?
Basically, there are facts on the ground that Israel itself has led for many, many years to try to enlarge the settlements, whether it's been a labor, so-called left government, or the right governments. We now have between 650,000 to 750,000 settlers in the area of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And yes, it has been moving in that direction. The problem is that the Trump administration single-handedly focusing and moving toward annexation and support for annexation, which Netanyahu has been calling for, which also undermines international law and human rights, underlines the International Court of Justice ruling on settlements, underlines many, many years going back to the 1967 occupation of the West Bank and Gaza for two-state solution, is quite problematic. I do agree with your guest that it has been moving to that direction. It's interesting now that many on the left, the so-called one-state initiative, led by Palestinians and some Israelis, have been calling for a one-state solution now, saying that the reality is facts on the ground, pushed by Israel, settler-only roads, many settlements, and infrastructure that has been created. That's the way it's moving, but it is unacceptable to move that way between the international community and Palestinian leaders have called for that shift, even though, again, we may be headed there and looking at a one-state situation. Whether or not it's apartheid or not is the question, whether it will be one democratic state or not.
Yousef, I wonder, and obviously it's obvious that Netanyahu is trying to also divide the Europeans, isn't he? Because he's being, cozying up to many of the more right-wing governments across Europe, and we can probably name quite a few of them, the likes of Hungary, even Greece at some level, and many, many others across the continent. And that's obviously then creating more divisions within the EU and how it responds to Israeli settlements, to BDS, to Israeli produce, that is from Israeli settlements and produced on Palestinian lands. What are your thoughts about that, and whether that division then hurts Europe's reaction to these sorts of things?
Well, yes, the EU has been one of the major supporters to the Palestinian Authority in order to make sure the Palestinians are ready for their state. But reality on the ground shows that Israel has killed the two-state solution. It's already dead, and this decision, the recent one, is just to make sure it's buried. I think we have already one-state solution with two systems, one apartheid imposed against the Palestinians, who are being treated as second or third class citizens, and one only for the Israelis. So what Palestinians are calling for is equal rights. But the thing is, the Palestinian Authority is still clinching to this so-called two-state solution, because one-state solution means no Palestinian sovereignty. What also made Palestinians are really let down is that the Arab nations, the Muslim world, is remaining silent. The U.S. administration is viewed as a not honest peace broker. The number of decisions taken, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel capital, the Golan Heights, cutting the financial support to the Palestinian Authority, all of that made the Palestinians are squeezed to the corner. It's a means of pressure on the PA to accept what's being offered on the table. So the EU now is against the U.S. position simply because it's against the U.S. policies, or against, let's say, Netanyahu's extreme policies in the Palestinian territories.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word. Of course, we appreciate all of our guests, Yousef, Harry, and Katherine, for their time, of course, and of course their insight as well on this issue. And it's certainly, this issue of Israeli settlements is not a new one. They've always been labeled illegal by the international community viewers. But what right does the U.S. have to come in, swoop in, and just say, listen, we're going to ignore international law and we're just going to do as we wish? They've already done as they wish when it comes to, in their minds at least, moving the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Something that, of course, much of the international community did not agree with. Now the EU saying that it doesn't agree with this decision of the US either when it comes to the settlements issue. But really, in many ways, the two-state solution that the EU is running after is sort of already dead, as we've all sort of agreed upon in this conversation. So what then next? Where does this move to next? Will the EU be able to hold on strong to its position with a more divided bloc now when it comes to the issue of Israel, especially with Netanyahu cozying up to so many governments in that bloc also? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Iraq, and a lot has been happening. So let's get through the list if we can very quickly. Even though back in early November, in fact, the Prime Minister had spoken of resigning, he has now officially said that he will do so. And there have been celebrations in some quarters about the fact that Adil Abdul Mahdi will be stepping down as Prime Minister of Iraq after, of course, we know these many, many weeks of protests that have been taking place in that country. Then we have, of course, the attack that's taken place on the Iranian consulate in Najaf, and Iranian interests have been attacked elsewhere in the country as well. What does this say about anger towards Iran in Iraq? Also, we know the numbers of those being killed in Iraq or have been killed so far are quite high. I mean, since October the 1st, the estimates are about 350 people have been killed since protesters took to the streets, of course, to decry corruption and the many, many other grievances that they have towards the sitting government right now. Then we also have Ayatollah Sistani, who is essentially the chief religious person within Iraq at this point in time, and he's spoken about obviously, warning the government about the violence and the violence on its part towards protesters, I should say, and clarify. He's also spoken about an enemy plot, quote unquote, to seek to create civil strife, bringing back an era of dictatorship. That was part, of course, of his statement. There is a longer statement there, which I'm sure we'll discuss with our guests as well. Joining us from London is Dara Salam, who is teaching fellow in the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS University of London. He has written on Middle East politics as well as political theory. Joining us from Basra in Iraq is Azhar Al-Rubaie, who is a journalist based in Iraq. His writing focuses on a variety of issues, including, in part, politics, wars, and human rights. And joining us from Doha is Zeidon Al-Kinani, who is a political analyst and writer. He specializes in geopolitics and identity politics with a primary focus on Iraq and the Middle East. Zeidon, Azhar, and Dara, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Dara, let me start with you. What do you make of the Iraqi prime minister's resignation? Is it enough?
Yeah, hi. Well, actually, the resignation of the prime minister comes a bit too late. He should have actually resigned when the death toll was mounting in protest. He's definitely responsible as a commander-in-chief of armed forces for the death occurred as a result of the peaceful demonstrations in Iraq, in many cities in Iraq, including Baghdad, Basra, Najaf, Nasiriyah, and others. So basically, I mean, the resignation should be considered as a win for the protesters, but that doesn't mean actually a huge change has happened. The protesters are actually demanding a change of the system rather than of one man. So the real question is whether actually the resignation of the prime minister will lead to any change. So by change, I mean a radical change of the political system, because that's what's at stake at the moment, in what's happening in Iraq.
Okay, so Azhar, tell us what are your thoughts sitting in Iraq? What does the resignation of Adil Abdul Mahdi mean? Does it mean that the system will change?
I'm totally agree with Dara what he mentions before, but I think so. What makes Abdul Mahdi to resign and to announce his resignation is after killing and injuring thousands of people in Iraq. That make a strong pressure on Abdul Mahdi to announce and declare his resignation. But I think the announcing of the Abdul Mahdi resignation didn't guarantee the protesters to send them back home. You know, it's just a beginning of the forms that the protesters demand since October 1st. Right. I think it's the start of the new conflict and a new challenge to the Iraqis. Why? Because the Iraqis are demanding and asking for the political system change and radical change across and all the cabinet, all the politicians in Iraq. And Abdul Mahdi, he just represents 1% out of the political class in the government. So the protesters across Iraq from Basra to the Najaf and Baghdad still continuing protesting until their demand are met.
Zeidon, what are your thoughts about this based system that is in Iraq? Many people say that essentially just allows certain individuals and groups to enrich themselves and expand their influence without any, of course, accountability.
Of course, the ethnic sectarian quota was a system that was installed in the country to drive people's attention away from the actual shortcomings, the actual governmental shortcomings towards the public services in the country, towards the very little development that we have witnessed in Iraq since 2003, towards the sectarian, political, militant policies and environment that was built across the country since the US-led invasion. Without being repetitive, from my colleagues about this is not enough and the revolution is not against one figurehead but against an entire system, which I totally agree with. I think focusing a bit on the details is that we need to focus on how the massacres in Nasiriyah was either going to start an armed conflict or was either going to achieve one of the symbolic achievements that happened, and that's the resignation of Adil Abdul Mahdi, the prime minister. It might not be the end goal. It might not be enough because Adil Abdul Mahdi, as Azhar mentioned, is 1% of the entire political system, but it at least shows that the pressures, the pressure of the peaceful protesters has been achieved. It's pressuring the government. Focusing on the Iranian element that you mentioned, the anti-Iran sentiment in the discourse of the Iraqi protest movement since early October is actually one of the main elements. When Iraqi protesters attack Iranian official buildings, they're not necessarily just focusing on Iran in itself, but Iran is a part of the bigger picture of the political system in Iraq. Iran is the regional factor that is supporting that regime in Iraq. Iran is a part of the Iraqi government. When Iraqis attack the Iranian consulate or any Iranian official building in Basra or Najaf or Karbala, they are attacking the Iraqi government. It's a collective attack.
That's an interesting point. Dara, I wonder what your thoughts are about that when it comes to the Iranian influence, because I imagine, and I'm not defending the Iranians, but I'm just playing devil's advocate here, that the Iranians would argue, listen, the quota system that has been brought in and is the system currently in place in Iraq, it's not like the Iranians brought that system in. That was the system brought in after the U.S. got involved in Iraq after 2003. So that's not the Iranians' fault, is it?
That's absolutely right. So the current system, which is called the muhassasa system or the apportionment system, is actually installed by the U.S. Administration back in 2003, and that was actually meant to recognize all different minorities and sects and religions. So in itself, I mean, that system should actually be in a way working according to some kind of an egalitarian system. But that actually backfired in the sense that it led to more sectarian entrenchments, and also obviously, I mean, that the majority could devour the minority, and this is the real problem. So it doesn't work. It doesn't work in this way. So there must be other guarantees if you install such a system. I mean, the guarantees cannot be only done by a written constitution, but also by the institutions. So how to build political, social, and economic institutions of the state that could guarantee those kind of rights and liberties. So that's why actually it didn't work at all in Iraq. And as we saw, I mean, this led to external powers like Iran, for example, or regional powers to interfere in the affairs of Iraq. And the protesters are very angry with Iran because of the reason that actually they see all the militias who are responsible for killing all these people and the security services, obviously, as proxies of the Iranian regime. So Iran has a major influence in Iraq, and to be clear about this, Iran is in a kind of a power struggle with the U.S. in Iraq, and as we see, Iran has an upper hand actually in Iraq in terms of running the politics and running the political domain in Iraq.
All right, so Azhar, I wanted to, on the issue, the sectarian system as well that is in place, the key religious figure in the country, Azhar Ayatollah Sistani, has always been fairly critical of, in fact, governments in Iraq, ever since he's been speaking out through his Friday sermons in Karbala and otherwise. What do you make of his latest statements when it comes to the need for electoral reforms? He's spoken about election reforms. That was a previous sermon. But he's also then spoken about and warned the country about enemy plots to create further civil strife and to bring back possibly an era of dictatorship. What does that warning mean, do you think, for Iraqis?
As usual, the Marja'iyya in Najaf every Friday they talk about what the challenges that might Iraq face in the future. But I didn't think so. They mean that the dictatorship will come back, but they just warn. They would like to warn the politicians in the government that if you didn't address the people and protesters' demand, we will just kick you out of the government. Just warning, just verbal warning to the government to achieve what protesters demanding since October 1. But I think the Marja'iyya and the Najaf Ashraf, the last Friday, they just stress on its speech just to make the politicians be aware and realize that the Iraqis, they can't stand them to be more in the seats and in their politician seats. That's why the Abdel Mahdi now announced his resignation to be out of the government. But I think the most challenging thing is not Abdel Mahdi resignation right now, but who is the alternative who will be after Abdel Mahdi. It will take longer time to approve the Abdel Mahdi resignation now in the parliament, and then who will be the alternative. I think the alternative one who will be from the same faces of the parties right now. The prime minister seat is very important to the parties in the Iraq and the Iranian-backed militias inside Iraq. So that's why the conflict and the protest will be escalated more than it's now. I think it will take very, very, very longer and a few coming months to achieve all that.
Okay, so I'll give the final word to Zeidon. Zeidon, what are your thoughts on Sistani's warning and his entire role really in all of this? Because it seems that he is, as I said in my earlier question to Azhar, being critical of the government on all the legitimate, of course, grievances of the people at the same time. But at the same time, this warning then sort of confuses at least me.
Well, that's the problem with Sistani's warning or criticism of the government. He would criticize the government on one hand, but then at the same time he would warn the Iraqi people about the uncertain future if this regime leaves, and that puts him in a very neutral position between the protesters and the government. And this is one of the main reasons why the Marja'iyya, which is the religious establishment in Iraq, is one of the main institutions in Iraq that lost a lot of popularity from the Shia component of the society before the rest of the components of the Iraqi society in this revolution. It's an uprising against the Iraqi reality, which includes the regime, the militias, the external factors, corruption, sectarianism, and the religious establishment, whether they have militias on the ground or whether they don't have, such as Sistani's Marja'iyya. So this is a revolution against everyone and everything, and we'll find, and this is regardless of the outcomes or the aftermath of Adil Abdel Mahdi's resignation. One minimal disagreement I would have with my colleague Azhar is that we shouldn't worry about who comes after Adil Abdel Mahdi, because if it is the same political parties from the ethnic sectarian quota that would appoint the next prime minister, then the revolution did not achieve anything, and they shouldn't even celebrate this symbolic achievement. The protests movement in Iraq is against the system and against the parliament that Adil Abdel Mahdi gave his resignation to replace him.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course, appreciate all of our guests for their time and, of course, their insight. And no doubt we'll be visiting this issue in the coming days as well, because this is certainly not over. Zeidon was speaking to us there from Doha, Azhar was speaking to us from Basra, and Dara was speaking to us there from London. Viewers, the situation in Iraq is certainly a complex one because of the system that has been put in place ever since the U.S., of course, invaded that country in 2003. Quota system, a sectarian system, one can argue possibly similar to what's the situation in Lebanon as well, with a sectarian system there, which just creates this vacuum and it allows for corruption to almost just fester within these systems. The Iraqis, of course, protesting against the entire system. So it's not just Adil Abdul Mahdi leaving and everything just falls into place magically. It's not about that one man. It was about what he represented and why he then was forced to resign by the people. Then we have this ominous, warning on the part of Ayatollah Sistani, the key religious figure in the country, as well, about enemy plots and creating strife and possible era of dictatorship being brought back, etc. That a bit of a confusing statement, if I'm honest. And then, of course, there's the Iranian role in Iraq, which many Iraqis are now becoming increasingly critical of. Is that fair? The Iranians, of course, would argue, as I'd put to Dara as well, that it wasn't them that brought in the sectarian system. They're sort of just taking advantage of it because it was sort of handed to them on a silver platter. We'll get back to this, of course, as I said, in coming days, but I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.